Welcome to the Love and Longevity Podcast, where we are just having conversations here. And those conversations are based off of love and longevity. So that ranges from love, friendships, relationships to aging in place, caring for our parents, caring for our grandparents, just caring in general for others, as well as just how to live your best life at every single stage. Every episode, we want to provide actionable insights, and I'm so excited for our guest. But first, my name is Christian Ross. I'm the founder and chief happiness officer of Happy Talks, where we provide social calls for older adults. Our whole goal is to curb loneliness. So excited for our guest, Blake of FitFixNow. Thank you so much for coming, Blake.
Thank you so much for having me. It can be a bit of tongue twister.
I always twist it. I know it, and I always twist it.
The hardest thing for me with it is that I feel like we've kind of missed the time for rebranding it if we had to. So trying to figure, because it is a tongue twister, and it worked in the beginning, but it was kind of, I don't know, it feels like a focus group name. And we went through exercises, but yeah, that's always a lesson I like to remember for the future.
Well, you know what we'll do is for this episode, we'll make sure to say FFN.
That'll work.
So
that's
that way,
totally fine.
That way I don't mess anything
or
up.
me.
So Blake, tell us about FitFixNow, FFN, and just the learnings that you've had so far.
Yeah. So the company started because I had been in kind of startup marketing and advertising for about a year. And my mom actually has spent her entire professional life as a professor of kinesiology at Georgia State and Georgia Perimeter College, what it used to be. And she was a certified personal trainer most of her adult life and taught ballet.
Okay, so I can't wait for you guys to meet his mom, who is the other half. I did not know that. That's great to know.
Yeah, and she realized that she had the credentials and the background and the experience to be able to teach continuing education for fitness professionals. And so she came to me and she said, I think we can make this. What do you think? And I thought it was a great idea. And so we came together and put together FitFixNow. And the concept is we teach personal trainers and group fitness instructors about trends in the industry, new research. We make sure that everything is as research and evidence-based as needed to be able to make claims, because that's one of the most important things is that fads happen all the time in fitness. Mm-hmm. All the time there are fads. Are fads safe? Are they effective? Do they last? There's all of these questions that go through. And it's also important to remember that the field of exercise science, compared to a lot of other kind of disciplines, is relatively new. When it comes to fitness, you find like very programmatic manuals from the early 1900s, right? One of the first ones would probably be like the Army's fitness manual for World War II. Calisthenics and stuff like that from a lot of military backgrounds and stuff like that. My mom says it all the time with her generation, you weren't running unless you were playing a sport or doing something. So the majority of the population, there wasn't this understanding that fitness was a key component of quality of life. Look at the difference between even how it evolves clothing, right? So think about what was socially acceptable for older people to wear 20 years ago versus now, right? And eventually you get the tracksuits and, my grandmother used to wear them all the time. But a lot of times, especially among men and whatnot, you had this mentality to use slacks and a button down and all this other stuff. They literally didn't even have the clothing to exercise, right?
I didn't even think about that.
It's funny, a lot of the courses that me and mom put together, our first freemium model like tries for free. And so we give like 10% of what a trainer would need for free so they can try it out. And the course that is actually a behavior change course because, for a personal trainer, if they're not able to influence behavior change in their client, It doesn't matter if they have the best information in the universe, they're going to quit. They're not going to see results and stuff. So it's important not just to know behavior change, but be able to teach and instill behavior change in their clients. A huge component of behavior change is fixing little habits. Those little habits are huge. We talk in business about barriers to entry, right?
Yep.
Barriers to entry exist in everything. So it's like, what's my barrier to entry in fitness, right? And some people, it's about finding their own. And this is especially true when it comes to older adults. As we age, the body can break down. And what we see is that the longer that you move, the longer that you put off a substantial decline.
And that's such a key point because, today we're talking about quality of life and movement. When you think about just quality of life of movement, that first part of making sure you have the clothes to wear,
Right.
to feel comfortable, never even crossed my mind.
And to be safe, I mean, when it comes down to it, especially older adults probably shouldn't be working out barefoot, right? Now, understand one of the hardest things when you talk about like general fitness trends is painting with a broad brush because everyone's going to bring in their exception of,
Exactly.
oh, this person's been doing yoga for 20 years and to go, okay,
We're not talking about
probably
you,
has their
Tom.
thing. We're
Not
talking
you, Tom. We're talking to Bob over there.
And so it's when you wear proper athletic shoes,
Mhm.
you have a more solid foundation and base. You are much less likely to fall. You're more likely to perform well in balance exercises and all of that. So that's why, when it comes down to that, the clothing, is their clothing restrictive, right? Is it too loose to where it's going to catch on something and cause a fall? All of these things, there's a
Yeah.
safety component. I always said that there's just in reference to like in the Bible, they talk about the full armor of God, right? You learn coming out throughout life that what you put on very much so kind of has an effect on your mindset. Changing into exercise clothing, especially taking an older person who might not have ever done exercise in their lives, it kind of helps the transformation. It helps the transition. We stop thinking about transitions being hard after somebody stops being a toddler, but in truth, transitions are hard throughout the rest of our lives. We sometimes acknowledge and sometimes not.
So
and you
true.
notice, especially when it comes to caring for older adults, that sometimes like having a ritual transition helps in little, almost imperceptible ways because it reduces anxiety. It becomes predictable, right? You can get
Mhm.
security from predictability. And so routine, just getting in the routine of putting on your walking shoes can change everything,
Right.
because you might not walk that day, but now at least you can.
And how would you, thinking about it from both perspectives, if you're the older adult, what are some things you think you should do to get into the mindset of just getting ready? And as an adult child who's helping that older adult, how can you help them? Like if you see that they're starting to gain weight or maybe they're being more sedentary, like what are some things that you can do to motivate them or just encourage them in their journey and be supportive?
The first thing that comes to mind is patience, and is the hardest thing. It is simultaneously the most important and most difficult part
So
of
true.
all of it. And so that requires a lot of personal work. So
Yeah.
keep that in mind. If you're an adult child of a parent, work on patience before you go into that, right? It's a practice. Patience isn't something that people have or they don't. It's something that people have been practicing or not. That's purely what it is. It's funny, one of the most recent Star Wars that came out, there was this idea that I couldn't put to words and their writers did. And it's impatience and victory guarantees defeat. And another version of that, in track and field or something like that, is that you don't let up before the finish line. You don't. You keep pushing through beyond the finish line, right? And it's that impatience to have won, to have gotten what you wanted, can often cause you to not get the thing you want. Before you even go into the situation, make sure, just like you want to put on fitness clothes before you go work out, you want to put on mentally this, okay, a little more patience.
Yep.
I'm going to kind of step out of me in the role that I've played my whole life as their child and hope that they can too.
Yeah.
So that we can, do this together. But it's also a very sensitive subject. My own father, he currently has pretty severe dementia and he's in a facility. I was his caregiver for a few years and I ran into this, right? Because it was always like, Dad, you got to do your exercises. Dad, you got to do this. And my dad had also been in a really bad car accident. He had been T-boned by an 18-wheeler back in the early 2000s. And so he had like full knee and ankle replacement in his 50s. And it wasn't a great job. It was okay, but there were problems and they had to get fixed along the way. And so just a whole lot of pain that impeded his ability to move. The weird thing is, it sounds weird conventionally, but, because you think you've got, okay, all of this metal in your leg and all this other stuff, all these problems. My dad held for years that he didn't want to do the exercises because he was in pain, right? But as his mental cognitive decline started getting worse, started having him just do the exercises, and he did. And he reported to me always feeling better.
Wow.
And it was interesting that as I was able to like get him out of the mindset, I can't do this because I'm hurt. When that mindset went away, and by the way, this is not to say that somebody should exercise just to exercise in terms of, you always need to check with a medical professional to see if you're clear. When I talk about him doing his exercises, these were exercises that an at-home physical therapist had come in. And what we actually did was, because I knew he couldn't remember everything, so I took pictures of him doing the exercises with her and printed them out so that he would have that ability. Okay, I need to stand here, hold on to this, and, stand on one leg, all of these other things, right? So don't think this is just like, oh, Dad, you need to go to the gym.
Yeah.
These were exercises given to him for the purpose of alleviating pain. And so keep in mind that as the person gets older, the need for some sort of certified professional, it becomes more of a requirement just because, for safety, knowing how these things work. So somebody's a little older, the reasons that you train kind of change, right? So you're training for playing with the grandkids. That ends up being one of the most compelling arguments to getting older people and older adults into these training programs is, truth be told, wouldn't you like to be able to get on the ground with them? Just sit there, right? Sit there and give them another Lego. You wouldn't believe how many grandparents find this really difficult. It's funny because my background in sports or the military or anything confirmed to me over and over that moving your body to the ground and then getting back to a standing position, whether that's burpees, up, down drills in football, any of that. But the gentlest version of that is stand up straight, and then get gently onto the ground and lay down, and then get back up to a standing position. It's a lot of effort. It's a lot of work. It is so hard.
No, it totally is. It makes me think of the Netflix show, The Blue Zones. And they showed in Japan how these ladies, they always sit on the floor. So because they're sitting on the floor, they're all the way down, they're coming up. They are doing squats all day long. I huffed and puffed coming up these stairs, but they are up and down like that. And so now I know after watching that, I am consciously trying to make an effort to make sure that I'm like, okay, even though I'm going to sit on the sofa, let me take a few minutes, sit down on the ground and just get up for 10 minutes. Little things like that. And what did you call it the other day? Remember how we were talking about, oh, you're going to do this, you're going to do short burst.
I think the term that I've seen is fitness snacking.
Fitness snacking.
That's it, yes.
Now, I would want a donut, but yes, fitness snacking is when you're doing those small movements. And I think that's another thing too, whether you are trying to get in better shape yourself and you're younger, or if you're an older adult, how can you incorporate fitness snacking? You're up against the wall, go down a little bit, go down some more, come back up. Just those little things that'll make a big difference.
Absolutely. And one of my favorite ones that I employ all the time is stand up from my desk, stand behind the chair and do 5 squats and then go sit back down.
Oh.
People a lot of times would be like, I had to conquer that mentality in my head.
Right.
That is such a self-defeating mentality. The self-judgment in this ends up being what prevents a lot of people from moving.
I could say from my own personal self, my husband works out. If he didn't work, he would work out 3 times a day. When he was working from home, he worked out 2 to 3 times a day. Now that he's back in the office 3 days a week, well, he definitely works out 1 time a day, 6 days a week. But that could be he's going to Peloton, to tonal, and then he might go for a run. It's almost still 3 exercises in one thing. Then I'm like, oh, I'm going to get myself together. He's like, okay, Christian. He just gives me the peace sign and walks away because I haven't been consistent. So, but that's part of that mindset that you talk about.
Right.
It's like giving yourself the grace. I've done 5 squats today. I've done, 5 of the 100s Pilates style. Whatever it is, giving yourself some grace and just letting yourself build on that habit. Hi, I'm Christian Ross, founder and Chief Happiness Officer of Happy Talks, where we provide social phone calls for older adults. So while you're thinking about the care of your loved one, remember, connection is key to optimal health, and we would love to partner with you. Go ahead and visit www.happytalks.com.
People obsess about one-time things instead of looking at systemic change.
Yeah.
Right? How do you change the system in which you live? In other words, I need to get this workout in, or I have programmed myself to expect working out at this time. The thing is that all of a sudden, once you've programmed yourself to expect little fitness snacks throughout the day, you've changed a system that ensures a higher probability of success. Because now it's a habit. Instead of putting all this effort into hitting this one, and then I've got to recharge that effort, hit this next day, recharge that effort, hit this next day. I'm not that way either.
Yeah.
I realize that I am far more effective at weekly consistency than I am at daily consistency. What
I
does
like
that mean
that.
for me? That means intermittent fasting is probably the most effective way for me to control my dietary intake. And I mean, I've tried everything from paleo. The first time I lost 50 pounds was with just tracking calories on a calorie restricted diet. What I find is that the things that require daily adherence, I kept failing with. And I would take these always as personal failures. And now in the past 2 years, like finding how fasting works for me in terms of maintaining healthy balance of macronutrients and all this other stuff and having one day to just do this, I'm far more consistent at that. I have maintained a much healthier weight, much better outcomes than I ever had doing anything else. And it's allowed me in my feeding time to really be more intuitive. Like when I come off a fast, I know exactly, my body is telling me what I want. It's a certain mixture of good, healthy fats, good, healthy carbohydrates, and solid proteins. Like these are the things that my body starts craving after that. I never knew this until I started doing it. But I had to first disabuse myself of the notion that I had to be a daily consistency. For me, I needed something that would be weekly consistency. And when it comes to fitness, for me, in order to get the consistency I need out of fitness, I schedule classes that I go to. That's how I do it.
Yeah.
I can work out alone. I enjoy working out alone. I like to slowly meander through a workout when I'm by myself, which is great, but I also need to push myself sometimes. And so I'll be supplementing the classes that I take. And that's what I need for my own personal fitness journey. You asked before about being an adult child talking to an older adult. About this, first and foremost, if the movement isn't going to be fun to that person, they're not going to do it.
Yeah.
And one of the most frustrating things a person can ever do is have a family member especially saying, oh, I think you would like this. I think, instead go in and say, what gets you moving, right? Somebody might like getting a cup of coffee. Well, you know what? Why don't you find a coffee shop? Find a place you can park that's like half a mile away. You walk the half mile to the coffee shop, you get your coffee, you walk your half mile out, right? Finding ways to incorporate movement into the things that they like, right? The things that they enjoy. They have to buy into the experience. If they aren't bought in, they're not going to do it.
Right. And that's what's so important too. I think just when we think about just communication with our parents is that we are getting that buy-in and that we are communicating respectfully. I have a friend who I'll never forget that she said the other day, she said, I was saying something to my mother and my mother said to me, I'm not your child, I'm an adult. And it's like, it's one of those things where because you start, you became a caregiver for your dad. So maybe.
We had that conversation a couple of times. Like that is a very common thing. And we were talking too about prepping yourself before you go into situations. And one of the hardest things to do is kind of acknowledge that roles are changing.
Right.
Because nobody wants to acknowledge it. Like pride robs us of more years than anything else. It just does.
So true.
It robs us of genuine relationships. It robs us of opportunities. And it's all about ego. And that ties into patience though, right?
Yeah.
We're impatient because we believe this isn't important to us. Like anytime somebody's being impatient, it's like, okay, you feel this is unimportant. Maybe not overall, but in that moment, that's, can say whatever we want, but that's how we're acting. I've realized. And so in that moment when I'm being impatient, I have to, okay, I'm kind of being a jackass. I'm being a jerk. And that's what it takes. I'm being a jerk. If you aren't honest enough, if you can't ever say I'm being a jerk, understand it. Not take it like I'm, beating up on myself, but hey, I was not being as respectful as I should have been. Accept it, learn from it, move on. It's all about iteration and repetition.
And when we just talk about movement as a whole, what are some things, of course, you mentioned mindset. What are some other things you just think if you're starting on this journey or if you're trying to get a parent or yourself that they should just be mindful of and things that they can do that they can start off small?
Yeah. So walking is always important, right? Over Thanksgiving, we visited my brother in New York and he and I were walking down the street. And I mean, there was this guy and he had to have been 80s, almost 90. And he had a puffy jacket. He had his walker.
You go,
and I mean,
boy.
and he was bent over hauling
Move it
down the sidewalk.
You said hauling it.
And I was just like, he's probably as stubborn as my dad, right? That stubborn, but I guarantee that man going on whatever errand he's doing is probably keeping him alive. That's something we want to consider, especially as we consider that older adults live in more drivable communities. And
Yep.
that's fine, but we need to find ways to adapt activities of daily living to incorporate more exercise, right?
And just like you said, the coffee shop. And all of this comes down to longevity. When you are active, when you are moving, you have the opportunity to live a longer, healthier life.
And it's the
Point blank
only way
period.
it's going to happen.
Right.
The worst newspaper stories ever. And not worst. I love them. I do, because they make me laugh. But it's like, John so-and-so turns 94 years old and he credits Dr. Pepper and cigars. Like I've seen
lots of
these
those.
articles, right?
Yeah.
This is an example of the logical fallacy called survivorship bias. And what that means is that what you're not seeing in his living example is all the people in his same situation who died horrible deaths because of diabetes, because of cancer,
Right.
because of all of these things, right? And so you have the one voice that survives saying, this is how I did, thinking that it's the correlation versus, causation or whatnot.
Yeah.
What is it? It might be something genetic. It might, chances are most other people living, drinking those Dr. Peppers and smoking those cigars aren't turning 94, So we've got to remember that, there are exceptions to every rule.
Yep.
We acknowledge this. That's an important thing to understand too, is that we need to have an understanding of balance as we move forward, because oftentimes the first thing that a lot of people think about is what they're going to miss,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're like, I've got to sacrifice for my fitness. I've got to sacrifice to eat nutritiously. I don't necessarily think that's true. You might have to sacrifice some old notions,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of times you can find something that's immensely satisfying, both with workouts and with diet, that can be modified. But it's important to do it in a way that doesn't feel like these are supposed to be their golden years, right? They need to be their golden years. So they need to be special. They need to be everything we want for our parents, to have quality of life in those golden years. They can. Little compromise here and there. Doesn't mean you can't have your favorite meal once a week or whatnot. It's just be more careful about it.
It's so funny because how you said about the cherry cokes or the Dr. Peppers and cigars. One of our members, Happy Talks members, they're 94. They have ice cream every single night. He says what ice cream he's had. And I'm like, that is incredible. And it's funny because I love it because his adult child is like, hey, he's lived to his 90s. He can have whatever he wants at this point.
I would do the same thing.
Yeah.
I can absolutely say that if I'm sitting here at 94, you best believe I'm going to have some ice cream.
Right. But you're, engaging with your parent and they're in their 70s. That's way different than when they're in their 90s.
Exactly.
So in their 70s, you want them to be around till 90. So you need to say, hey, let's look at that fitness snacking. Let's look at things. What do you want to do?
And I think you hit something that I think a lot of people gloss over that need to pay attention to, is that phases are different. 60s will be different than 70s, will be different than 80s and 90s, right? So, and it's important that you not treat them in their 70s as if they're in their 90s. That, I think, is a large mistake that often does happen.
I think it happens a lot. And that also comes to, which we will definitely have some conversations on, ageism.
Yes.
Because one word that we need to take out of our vocabulary, at least as often as it's used, is the word elderly. A lot of people, they know someone 70-some years, they're like, oh, they're an elderly person. No, they're not. Elderly means frail.
Right.
That person who's 70-some years old, 80-some years old, going on cruises, volunteering for the church, they are not elderly. They are an older adult.
Definitely the language you use surrounding this, and I've learned this, not to be like cynical or anything, but as a marketing professional, when it comes down to it, people who are in the demographic do not want to be called senior. They don't want to be called golden. They want to be treated like people. And I think that we have these words that is like, oh, but it's got to be distinguishing. But we don't realize that sometimes these words can be...
They can be hurtful.
They can be hurtful, yeah. Especially for people who aren't ready for it, right?
Right. I think of my own mother. Right now, she's on a 15-day cruise, something ridiculous. She's absolutely living her best life. She stays up till 3. She goes out. She plays Bikino. I don't even know all the things that she does. There's no way I would describe that woman as elderly.
Mm-hmm.
And if I did, she would surely correct me and she would surely be offended.
Sure.
And so I think that's one thing that we have to be so intentional about, just like you said, is our language. If you are making suggestions to mom, you're not saying, well, mom, you're elderly now. That is not the move, y'all.
It's important to walk into it with this mindset that I will make the mistake and I will apologize when I do.
Exactly.
I'm not going to get mad at them for getting mad at me.
Yes.
Like, we're going to stop the anger cycle and we're going to say, okay, I apologize. Like I
like that.
I hurt
Stop
you.
the anger cycle. Exactly. Yeah.
I'm angry at you, so you're angry at me. Like that's why families stopped talking for decades,
You're
right?
right.
It's a stupid anger cycle that if you just stopped it at one point, push the reset button and come back, I think we're kind of touching on too is a huge component of working with the population and just being understandable, empathetic, and say, hey, if everything that I knew in life was changing, how would I feel?
Right.
We get on this upward trajectory in our 20s, 30s, and 40s, right? For better or for worse, we're kind of better off tomorrow than we were today. And there's a point in your life when that's going to get inverted. And if we stop and think about how will this make me feel when I'm not the one who can pick up the heavy thing anymore. This gets to the other thing talking with adult children is prepping yourself in your 30s for becoming old. And I think that the important thing with this is saying, one day this is going to happen to me. Already by telling myself that, I'm already more prepared for it when that day comes because I'm very klutzy. I can endurance run, but I can't get there very fast. One of the few things I can do is pick up heavy objects. And so, it's nice when friends move and stuff, and I'm like, okay, I can help with this. When that goes away, that's going to be a huge aspect of my identity that I'm going to have to really address. You know, I remember the reason this holds to me is because I remember when I was in 8th grade, my teacher had kind of a moment where she was like, class, I'm sorry, like I'm having some trouble. She was tearing up about something that we couldn't figure out, and she was like, my husband slipped a disc and he was like facing the reality of getting older is very hard. Now I remember that.
And I think that's one of the things is that, again, it's grace, it's empathy, it's patience with yourself, it's patience with others. It's all these life lessons that we know we should do on a daily, but that especially when we bring our relationships in there, we have to have a different level of that. Thank you, Blake, so much. Please come back.
Thank you for having me. Absolutely will. I will bring my mom with me. She would love to talk about all of these things too. So thank you for having us. I really appreciate it.
And where can they find you, Blake?
So you can find us at FitFixNow on Instagram. That's at FitFixNow. You can find us at fitfixnow.com as well.
Perfect. And we will also have that in the show notes. Thank you so much, Blake.
So much.
We'll see you soon. Thank you for joining us at Love and Longevity with Christian Ross. If you enjoyed what you heard, give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform and be sure to follow us. And if you like more from me, you can subscribe to the Happy Talks newsletter at the link in the show notes. Thanks for listening.